and I will keep an eye on people coming in to join the session. And so over to James and Caitlin for a constructionist green criminology for a climate in crisis.
Thanks very much for that, Angus. So, hello everyone. My name's James Heydon, University of Nottingham, and I'm an assistant professor in criminology here.
And I'm Caitlin Bunce. I'm a PhD student at the University of Nottingham studying the construction of water pollution.
So what we're going to talk to today about is kind of constructionist thought, which is present but emerging in green criminology, and what we're going to talk about is how it can be used to provide a more incisive analysis of environmental harms, we think. This work is preliminary and ongoing, so please keep that in mind, but any feedback, recommendations, questions at the end will be greatly received because it'll help us inform our writing on it. So to demonstrate the usefulness of constructionism, we're going to conceive of the climate crisis as encompassing multiple dimensions of crises. So in other words, the climate crisis doesn't just equate to global warming, but equates to a great many other environmental harms that we think would benefit from green constructionist thought. So to do this, we're going to use the examples of water and air pollution in the UK as we go through. Also, just a caveat, we've used some AI images in this, which you just notice that AI does struggle with words, so that's why some of the images look a bit odd when you zoom in on the words. So the climate crisis. So increasingly it's increasingly clear that a polycrisis is underway, right? So according to the United Nations, the climate is in crisis. This is the language that they use. The Earth is warming at a rate not seen for thousands of years. Sea ice is shrinking over 10% each decade, and sea levels are going to rise by about 20% of the global mean along 2/3 of the global coastline well into 21st century. We've got ocean acidification, deoxygenation, which are irreversible in the next 100 years, while extremes of kind of heat, rain and drought are going to increase in the frequency and intensity across most land regions. These effects interact with each other, which compound the risks and cause them to cascade for humans and non-humans alike. So we're going to see effects on water availability, crop production, livestock health, fisheries yields. These are going to happen alongside malnutrition, infectious diseases, and human displacement. And so taken together, this is creating, at the bottom there, where we talk about a kind of discontinuity with a world where past environmental conditions were a reasonable guide for those to come. So climate change kind of heralds this future defined by short and long-term instability and uncertainty for humans and non-humans alike. And so when you take it together, we think the term polycrisis captures this multifarious, multidimensional situation quite clearly. And much like the climate crisis as a human-made event, so too are issues like water pollution, like air pollution, land degradation, wildfires. So what we think is to speak of a climate crisis isn't simply to speak of global warming, but also those environmental and human issues that are folded into it. So what this kind of urgency tends to do is it means climate effects dominate the public and media narrative. So what De Meyer calls issue-based conceptualizations tend to paint a threatening picture, and they result in doom and gloom storylines that tend to foreground these massive climate risks. And what this tends to do is emphasize harmful outcomes over the kind of unsustainable social arrangements that come before, that prefigure their emergence. And so vulnerability of ecosystems is going to be strongly influenced by past, present and future patterns of consumption and production, increasing demographic pressures and kind of further influencing unsustainable use and management of land, ocean and kind of water resources. So it's the kind of the social arrangements that go unseen beforehand that we're kind of focusing in on here.
So objectivist harm in green criminology. Green criminology has long recognised this relationship between environmental decline and the ordinary, the everyday and routine activities of organisations and individuals. For many in the field, it is not deviance from, but adherence to legal norms that presents itself as problematic. This has compelled scholars to use harm over crime to capture the environmental degradation arising through these normal societal conditions. These harms tend to be justified in evidence using scientific data, and this reflects what we call an objectivist approach that dominates green criminology, and it's said to provide a secure future for criminological inquiry. Objectivism in green criminology follows traditional sociological tendencies, for instance, by structural functionalists, to adopt these predefined areas of investigation. So objectivist definitions hold the notion that at their core, social problems contain this objective, out there element to which objective knowledge about their condition and their problematic nature is possible. And in this sense, environmental problems are pre-selected and primed for criminological analysis.
And so you can see this in green criminology with its tendency to use kind of different coloured typologies with which to categorise environmental harms or green crimes, whichever term you want to use. So, for example, White's initial calls for various colours of crime to bring attention to this diversity of topics like brown, green and white issues. We've seen the subsequent emergence of blue criminology that's talked to aquatic environments, and then combinations of these colours like red-green, which relates to environmental and economic degradation and class inequality, green-blue, which relates to sustainability and security, and then green-grey, which relates to water mismanagement. So all of these things tend to conceive of harm as something that already exists and towards which we need to explain. And then there's also political economic green criminology that tends to dominate, and it understands green crimes as behaviours that can be defined objectively. So it refers to scientific evidence related to the assessment of ecological destruction. And what it argues is that this strikes a productive balance between kind of uncritically accepting legal definitions, which have been, very widely criticised in green criminology and semiology, and then adopting a view of the very nature of crime as entirely subjective and socially constructed. So it suggests that with the backing of science, ecological disorganisation is argued to be a far more objective and apolitical standard for defining green crime. And then it says that this allows, reportedly, the scientific basis allows for a discussion of environmental harms outside of moral philosophies, which is obviously quite a significant claim. And so what we think are the kind of limitations of this are threefold. So in the absence of legal definitions, scientific evidence is widely used to substantiate these claims of harm. And what this tends to do is take often as unproblematic science as an apolitical resource, and it suggests that it provides an undistorted window on objective conditions. There's not really much recognition that scientific evidence is a social artifact, as Kenneth talks about, resulting from the access, identification, measurement, analysis and communication of conditions by scientists. And what we think is that sensitivity to this is important because official regulation and recognition of an environmental harm is informed by the way that it is identified, evidenced, defined and framed. This is a point made by Burns. And so what we think is by uncritically accepting authoritative scientific evidence as the basis for harm, green criminology risks unquestionably replacing one form of definitional dogmatism, the legal basis for definitions, with another as the scientific basis. Second point that we want to make is that the use of harm requires other theories to provide kind of etiological causal accounts of the environmental conditions being signalled. And this is kind of common. Maldistributed environmental harms are analysed using the lens of environmental justice. I've done that myself. Ordinary harms of consumption, Agnew's work explains it using social psychological theories, and the harms of production tend to be explained by using the treadmill theory or state corporate crime theory. These works are obviously insightful, they've formed a backdrop for most of green criminological work to date, but they do exemplify how the harm concept is limited as kind of acting as a descriptive proxy for issues that are already recognised as problematic, regardless of their legality. And what we think is not only does this kind of direct research towards already popularised accounts of publicly visible high status problems, it turns attention away from questions about how such harms come to be an object for criminological analysis in the first place. So if we're going to phrase this differently, harm becomes the baseline for subsequent inquiry into its existence, kind of removing questions about the ways in which a given activity comes to be recognised as environmentally problematic in the first place. And what we think here is that subjective judgment has a key role in problem construction, but it tends to be overlooked by this objectivist approach. So how a problem is understood in official rules and then how it's subsequently enforced is highly dependent on how we come to understand its nature. And then thirdly, this feeds into the fact that green criminology, much like social science more generally, focuses on what Burns calls ontology, which is the way things exist, as opposed to what he calls a fundamental ontology, which focuses on the meaning of environmental problems to human society. So by focusing on the former, the meaning underpinning a given environmental harm or problem, again, is left underexplored. And we think insufficient consideration is placed into how these harms become an object for criminological analysis. So we're trying to sensitize green criminology to the process by which how we decide what an environmental problem comes to be in the first place, but then also why some things are not conceived as an environmental problem subsequently. So there is some movement in green criminology that speaks to this constructionist perspective, you know, Rob White, Avi Brisman and South, McClanahan, but all of them in many ways have written constructionist works and form the basis for what we're saying here. They are effectively green criminological attempts to understand environmental harms and crimes as socially constructed. And what we think is that this kind of emerging body of work points to a way in which we might be able to think and move beyond the objectivism that dominates existing conception of harm. And we think this holds three core advantages here. The first, we think it offers an alternative to existing and dominant efforts to define harm using scientific data without questioning how that data comes to be. Some might think that this is a needless endeavour, but as we will hopefully highlight today, asking these questions does raise fundamental consequences for how a harm is defined, responded to, and ultimately controlled. And in the context of the polycrisis, these questions are going to become increasingly important over time. And much of green criminology is concerned with this, like reversing or ameliorating unsustainable practices, but be these through ordinary harms or state corporate activity. But to do this, we also have to understand what harm is, where it's originating from, how it came to be known about, what its name indicates, how it's framed, and all these kind of things are implicated then in the response. And to do that, we have to start questioning the meaning of harm at that very first point. Secondly, as we've already noted, we're now in a period of kind of escalating instability. And this has been recognised by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and others as requiring kind of a greater emphasis on regulation in pursuit of adaptations. And in this context, we have to understand how these regulatory organisations are defining harm, defining pollution, framing it, monitoring it, controlling it, and then cleaning anything up. And so this period we're in is going to require more of these questions being asked, and we think green criminology would benefit from these tools to be able to do it. A part of that is going to be questioning how scientific data is used to define problems. And then thirdly, we don't think we should uncritically accept scientific data. And one of the ways we can do this is by recognising this process of construction, the definition, identification, framing of pollution, the kind of practicalities of monitoring, the assumptions of modelling, that's a big part of pollution control these days, quality of the final data sets, all these kind of things are implicated, and they raise kind of significant questions about the neutrality of scientific data. And it's important to green criminology, I think, because it means that we can critically shine a light on it. And so what we're going to do now is suggest a model from the constructionist literature on social problems and show how that can be applied in relation to environmental harms related to water pollution and air pollution. So if we take this model here, this is a model that I devised from the social problems literature in a paper in the British Journal of Criminology. And the social problems literature is a branch of constructionist literature in sociology, most concerned with understanding how a problem like an environmental harm comes to be recognised and responded to officially. And in this sense, a social problem is whatever social groups respond to, much like deviance, right? So Howard Becker himself and his work on deviance is a founding pillar of the social problems work. There was just a split earlier on in the criminological literature. And so it's useful here because it allows us to ask the question, why has the state responded in this way, or why hasn't the state responded at all to these kind of emerging environmental problems? And it brings attention to the way in which a matter of fact, to use Bruno Latour's phrase, becomes what's called a matter of concern and then regulated. So the model kind of provides this common portrait by which conditions come to be constructed as a social problem. And what I did is I condensed this process into 3 stages, which we'll just briefly explain here before applying it to air and water pollution.
So with stage 1, first a social phenomenon needs to be recognised as problematic. And there's no immutable link between objective conditions and subjective understandings of them. So given that harmful social conditions or arrangements are not automatically perceived as problematic, then this stage speaks to the moral enterprise of individuals and interest groups in publicly recognising and defining such features under these terms. Ultimately, this stage cautions that social groups must perceive an issue, interpret it as problematic, and garner support solutions by combining with other interest parties to pressure for official action. So by stage 2, rule creation, the prior stage must be successful and the social problem receives this official recognition. Here, the issue is acknowledged as problematic by government institutions, and various interests have been marshalled to create a rule or policy, and formal enforcement arrangements are determined. And at this stage, compromises, concessions, and trade-offs are all implicated in the final rules and plans for their implementation. At this point, discussion moves from what ought to be done to proposals determining that this and that should be done. And it reaches its peak in the creation of legislation and policy outlining the rules and introduction of mechanisms for their administration.
And that brings us on to the final stage, which is enforcement of these rules. And here, criminology has been concerned with this in terms of policing and in terms of regulation for a significant amount of time. This is concerned with the kind of myriad of unintended consequences as the rules in application become modified, twisted, and reshaped in that kind of application. So this might also manifest in a lack of activity, because as we all know, the existence of a rule doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's going to be enforced. Sanctioning might differ between time and place, depending on the intentions, resources, capacities of the regulators, and it can be influenced by political and economic decisions. So enforcement might aim to change behaviour instead of punish as well, which reflects this kind of compliance-based approach to regulation that dominates and has dominated under neoliberalism. And so at this stage, kind of judgments of outputs and outcomes are also made, where outputs are concerned with whether legislation or policy has achieved its aims, and outcomes are focused on whether or not it addresses the original problem. So you have different standards by which to judge enforcement. But the key thing is that taken together, these stages are neither fixed nor mutually exclusive, and movement between them isn't mechanical or linear, and many of the kind of problematic conditions that we know about may never enter the process at all, requiring explanation. So this is obviously here, this helps us understand how activities are constructed as harmful and problematic or not at all, and then allows us as green criminologists to evaluate and kind of recommend improvements to any regulatory responses at each stage of the problem. So this is quite abstract at the minute. I'm very aware that we've stayed in the role of theory and the role of abstraction. So what we're going to do now is we're going to draw on our research in air and water pollution to demonstrate how some of the issues arise at each stage to obstruct the way in which harms come to be seen and responded to as problematic. So if we take stage 1, the problem definition, defining a problem is not straightforward, right? Scientific data, as we've said, plays a crucial role in making persuasive arguments, particularly about environmental issues, but data on its own is not enough. both air and water pollution present challenges due to their invisibility in particular, right? Their dispersed nature and the difficulty of establishing cause and effect relationships between exposure and illness. The most immediate difficulty in defining pollution is visibility. So pollution by its nature in terms of air and water doesn't belong in a given space. It can't be if it can't be directly seen, smelt, or otherwise perceived, kind of sense perception, it becomes harder to be defined as a problem.
So water pollution is often more visible, with sewage overflows, floating debris and discoloured water providing quite tangible evidence of contamination. And it also provokes a strong sensory reaction, so disgust, revulsion, and immediate desire for avoidance. The presence of raw sewage in rivers triggers what Douglas called an unwanted intimacy, so an invasion of personal space that disrupts the boundaries between the clean and contaminated. And the public response to this is often visceral and immediate. So the presence of matter or place, sewage, waste, or chemicals makes it easier to see water pollution as unacceptable.
So if you contrast this with air pollution tends to lack an immediate visibility. So fine particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and kind of other air pollutants are imperceptible to the senses. You often can't even smell it. This makes it harder to claim as a problem and for the public to then sympathise with these claims. This is unlike water pollution, which can cause illness within hours. Air pollution's health impacts accumulate over time. So a person might not notice their exposure to particulate matter until it contributes to kind of a long-term respiratory or cardiovascular illness years later. And what this does, it complicates efforts to establish clear causal relationships at this beginning of the process, making air pollution seem less urgent despite its significant effects. And if we move on from that, even when pollution is perceptible, its social meaning varies. So if we take wood smoke pollution in the UK, it's the largest source of particulate matter currently in the UK and actually in Europe. The smell of wood smoke, though, is associated with comfort and nostalgia rather than harm. While you compare this with sewage in a river, which is widely regarded as disgusting, burning solid fuels in private homes is not typically framed as an environmental problem. And the setting in this respect also matters. Like pollution in public spaces is easier to define as a collective problem, whereas pollution produced in private settings, like someone using their stove, remains largely invisible in public discourse. So you've got things like domestic wood burning peaks in the evenings and winter months when fewer people are outside, which limits their ability to see it and report it. And then obviously it's another obstacle to be defined as a problem. Whereas by contrast, water pollution events, particularly storm overflows, which release sewage during high rain episodes, these are often highly visible, media friendly, someone taking a photo of a sewage overflow pipe, and they occur in places of shared public use, like rivers or beaches.
And another major factor is how pollution data itself is communicated. So water pollution has become increasingly quantifiable through sewage maps and real-time monitoring apps. Organisations like Surfers Against Sewage and the Rivers Trust have made water pollution data publicly accessible, amplifying awareness and enabling media coverage. So when the first national sewage map was launched in 2020, it revealed not only the extent of sewage discharges, but also their frequency and duration. And this plays into the media's preference for big numbers to convey a crisis. So as Best notes, a big number implies there is a big problem. Recent reports highlight that in 2024, raw effluent was discharged into waterways for almost 300,000 hours, up from 196,000 in 2023. So such figures reinforce claims of a worsening situation and help to generate public outrage.
If you contrast this as well with air pollution data, though it's extensive, it doesn't generate the same immediate response. So you've got similar maps there on the slide where air quality sensors across Europe and the UK provide real-time pollution data on real-time pollution events, much like sewage overflows. The absence of that direct sensory experience or ability to represent it in the media makes these numbers less compelling. And unlike water pollution, where images of sewage spills provoke disgust, air pollution lacks that equivalent visual trigger. So there's no single pollution event to point to in the way that an overflowing drain or kind of polluted river can be. So the effects of air pollution remain diffuse, spread over time and space, making it harder to define as a problem in the public imagination. So if we look at stage 2 of the model, rule creation, the next stage focuses on that institutional response to the defined problem. So in the case of air and water pollution, initial regulations emerged as a result of highly visible problems, which then shaped subsequently how pollution has since been understood, monitored and controlled. However, these frameworks are struggling now to adapt to newer, less perceptible pollutants, complicating efforts to define and manage environmental harms. So because of this, while some knowledge is included in rule creation to make an environmental problem a manageable problem, other knowledge ends up being excluded. So if we take the creation of rules around air pollution in the UK and, wood smoke and domestic combustion specifically, these rules and regulations that we have now were shaped largely by the Great Smog of London in 1952. So this smog episode was created by coal smoke from people's chimneys, and it led to 12,000 deaths over a 4-month period, overwhelmed hospitals with respiratory cases, and obviously triggered significant political pressure where coal burning ended up being defined as a problem requiring a response. That's why we now have the Clean Air Act of 1956. This legislation, what it did is it introduced smoke control areas which prohibited chimney smoke unless you were using a new stove or a new fuel that released less smoke. But if you were found burning coal in these areas, then people were fined. If you look at this alongside the gradual rollout of domestic gas supplies, smoke control areas helped to reduce coal use and then shifted attention to other sources of air pollution, like traffic emissions. And generally speaking, this has been the approach to regulating domestic combustion ever since.
And similarly, the regulation of water pollution was driven by a very specific environmental problem known as the Great Stink of 1858. The smell of the River Thames, exacerbated by untreated sewage, forced the government to act. The associations with cholera outbreaks heightened the urgency, leading to the creation of Bazalgette's sewage system, which remains the foundation of London's wastewater infrastructure today. And these early interventions framed pollution in terms of visibility, olfactory, and immediate public health threats, reinforcing the idea that regulation must focus on these clearly identifiable contaminants. So while these early regulatory frameworks were effective in addressing the most apparent and initial forms of pollution, so smog from house coal and sewage in rivers, they were built around highly visible pollutants detectable through sense perception. And the result of this is a regulatory legacy that prioritises what can be seen, smelled, and directly linked to public health crises. And this creates a challenge when dealing with emerging pollutants that do not necessarily fit these historical patterns.
And if we look at air pollution, this regulatory focus remains on visible smoke and combustion emissions, so particularly from domestic chimneys. So the shift to what they call clean burning technologies, like an enclosed wood stove where you can close the door, was intended to reduce visible smoke. But the trouble is these still produce ample amounts of particulate matter, and this is invisible and is becoming a major health concern. So regulations that were built around reducing visible smoke don't target these particulate matter emissions because they're a different type of pollutant. And despite being linked to cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, the regulations simply can't capture particulate matter.
And similarly, water pollution regulation has historically focused on managing visible contaminants such as sewage. So the Environment Agency's permitting system regulates discharges into water bodies, largely targeting known pollutants. So the Storm Overflows Discharge Reduction Plan continues this approach, and it aims to reduce stormwater discharges near bathing waters by 2035 and eliminate them entirely by 2050. And this has a £60 billion investment over 25 years, and the plan seeks to control a problem that is well understood and easy to communicate.
However, though, both air and water pollution frameworks struggle to incorporate more recently recognised contaminants. So you've got things like particulate matter, ultrafine particles, which are even smaller than what's called PM2.5, and emissions from deregulated stoves challenge these traditional air quality regulations, or at least pose a challenge to them. And in water pollution, the rules around discharge and contamination don't fully account for increasingly recognised problems like microplastics, brake dust, pharmaceuticals, pesticides and heavy metals. And a large reason for that is that pollutants don't always provoke the same sensory response as smoke or sewage, making them harder to define as urgent problems at stage 1 and in turn harder to capture under established regulatory regimes in stage 2. So the third and final stage then looks at the enforcement of rules and the challenges that emerge in that application. So the implementation of legislation is shaped by practical obstacles, political pressures and regulatory limitations, to name a few. But if we take our examples again, in the case of air and water pollution, enforcement isn't just about the existence of rules, but about the ability to detect violations, build cases and ensure accountability. And for this reason, enforcement might be inconsistent, ineffective or even counterproductive, undermining that original intent of regulation and then creating a situation where environmental issues aren't fully constructed as environmental problems. So for enforcement to actually occur, the pollution at a very basic level must be detectable. And this presents a challenge for air pollution regulation, where enforcement mechanisms are designed around visible smoke rather than invisible fine particulate matter. The smoke control areas, if we're going to use the wood smoke example still, established into the Clean Air Act rely on detection of chimney smoke, not PM2.5, which is invisible. And this creates a paradox where so-called clean stoves designed to reduce smoke can still emit significant amounts of PM2.5 while being considered legally compliant. And this is why there is little enforcement of smoke control areas, because they are geared towards visibility as opposed to invisibility.
And we see a similar issue with water pollution, where some instances are easier to detect and prosecute than others. And this shapes which cases receive attention. Sewage pollution from combined storm overflows is monitored to some degree, and liability is tied directly to the water companies responsible for wastewater treatment. Public awareness has led to increased reporting, and where the Environment Agency can prove a breach, such as an illegal discharge of sewage during dry weather, significant fines can be issued. However, the EA's ability to identify and confirm breaches is constrained by a reliance on self-monitoring by water companies, which removes direct oversight from enforcement bodies. And without independent verification, much pollution is assumed to be within permitted levels, even if the reality differs. And the practical difficulties of responding to pollution events further complicate enforcement. And historically, the EA had local teams who could attend pollution incidents quickly. Now all reports are sent to a central office where decisions on whether to actually go and investigate are made remotely. Many incidents go unattended, leading to missed cases and enforcement officers arriving too late to witness the pollution. This also results in cases that can't be pursued. As a former EA employee noted, this results in a vast number of small pollution events being overlooked, despite their cumulative impact and likelihood of escalation if not addressed early. And even with the flawed enforcement mechanisms permitting, certain types of pollution water pollution escape regulation entirely. So in air pollution, emissions from eco-burners can be difficult to detect using sparse monitoring networks. Vehicle brake dust and ultrafine particles fall out the scope of traditional monitoring. And similarly, in water pollution, road runoff is discharged into streams and rivers through unpermitted pipes, meaning there is no regulatory framework to govern these pollutants unless they are explicitly designated as high risk. As of today, no discharge source has been permitted from the road. As one EA employee observed, the lack of permits for highway discharges is a political issue. There is no appetite for the regulation of one government department by another. And this political reluctance prevents meaningful oversight and reinforces gaps in enforcement.
Bunch of time, so I'm going to move on to the last slide.
Okay.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit at length there, but that's fine. So if we look at this as a whole and take those three stages together and what it can tell us, we think there is value in recognising processes underpinning the construction of this term environmental harm. If we're being specific, we think those different stages can tell us much about the response. And each stage also can be taken independently. There's no reason why you have to take the whole process together. You can focus in on each stage and how a certain problem is defined, framed, identified, how scientific data is used in certain ways, how transparent it is, to really shine light on what is being regulated and also what isn't being regulated. And we think what this does is it puts green criminology in a more kind of critical position in relation to science and the agencies that are using it. And as a consequence, if we start thinking through that in relation to specific crises that we're starting to see emerge, and we think that the solution-oriented potential of green criminology can play a bigger part going forward, because it allows us to shine a light on things that are defined as environmental problems, both officially and unofficially, but then also put pressure on organisations that aren't defining certain things as harmful and problematic. So we do think it holds the potential for something quite fruitful going forward. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to stop the recording and then open the floor for questions. So if you have a question, either use the raise your hand button, or